Good evening. We will now begin our session.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for what promises to be an interesting and important discussion. My name is Leanne Matlow, and I am the UJA 2021 Rally for Recovery co-chair alongside Craig Walters. As a community convener, one of UJA's strengths lies in bringing experts, educators, and community members together to have difficult discussions, share resources, and support one another. I can't think of any area that's more important than the fight against anti-Semitism. That's why it is one of our 3 pillars of the core priorities of the UJA 2021 campaign. We've all seen that last week that anti-Semitism in our public schools is not a thing of the past, but a real and growing threat, one that Jewish educators, parents, and students are on the front lines navigating. With the support of our advocacy agent, CJA, last week, our community mobilized by the thousands in a matter of hours by spreading the word on social media and sending message to the TDSB. We stood against Trustee Lalka, who was right to expose the anti-Semitism she had uncovered at work. We saw last week what a difference we can all make when we unite and have our voices heard. We also saw just how alarming the rise is, proving to be, and how much work we still have to do. Tonight, we'll be hearing from a few community members who have made it their mission to address this challenge. We are very grateful to have these experts guide us through this important conversation. To kick us off, I'll pass it over to Noah Gano, who recently joined UJA as the Associate Director of Community Mobilization with UJA Genesis, arriving with over 20 years experience in community engagement and development. Over to you, Noah.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much to you, Leanne, and my thanks to all of you for joining us this evening, for being a part of this conversation, and especially for being the pillars of strength that you are in our community. We are immensely grateful for our educator community, for our parents, for everyone who is making a difference in the lives of our younger generations. And being here tonight may be the first step for some of you, it may be another step along your journey, but we are here to support you and we are listening. And as Leanne mentioned, the entire community is listening and hearing your need and hearing your concerns. We saw that recently as thousands of our community members came out to make their voices heard in support of our Jewish educators, in support of Trustee Lalka, and in support of being on the side of justice. So I thank you all for being here tonight. We'll be speaking with Noah Schack from CJA and also Dr. Rachel Fish, who is joining us. And we'll begin the conversation tonight with Noah Schack, who is the vice president at CJA, where he leads the GTA regional team and Ontario government relations. He has more than a decade of experience in government relations, political research, and communications with a focus on Canadian public policy, foreign affairs, and advancing the diverse needs and interests of the Jewish community. I have also worked very closely with Noah in my 2 months on the job here at the UJA, and I must tell you how tirelessly he has been working for our entire community. We are so grateful to have you here to join us tonight, Noah. Thank you.
Noah, thank you for that warm welcome. And it's hard to believe you've only been here for 2 months. I can't imagine taking on the challenges that we have without you on the team. So it's a real testament to the impact that you've had in such a short time.
Thank you so much. It really, this work is so empowering when you think about the amazing people in our community who are doing such amazing things. So we really do hope this conversation tonight empowers all of you and leaves you feeling encouraged and hopeful. So Noah, I think we'll start with the pressing issues that we're all facing right now and thinking a lot about that are top of mind. Let's unpack some of the events at the TDSB. Where are we now and how did we get here?
So, what's been on everybody's mind, I think, on this call has been the events that took place at the last TDSB Board of Trustees meeting around the potential censure of Trustee Lalka. And that story begins back in May with the distribution of materials intended for educators to use in the classroom that contained resources that were anti-Semitic, supported violence, and even a listed terrorist organization that's banned here in Canada, the PFLP. And at the time, CJA, along with other organizations, raised the alarm with the TDSB around the damage that these materials could cause, particularly given the alarming spike in anti-Semitism that we experienced that month. But of course, these things would never be acceptable. I mean, it seems crazy to think that materials promoting a terrorist organization would be put in a classroom. The board immediately removed the materials and launched an investigation into the staff member who had sent them around. And it's at that time that Trustee Lelka spoke out, condemning the materials, calling out the anti-Semitism and the promotion of violence that were contained within some of the resources, and reiterated the need for an investigation. That investigation took place, and ultimately the staff person who distributed the materials was reinstated to their position. Meanwhile, that individual initiated a complaint with the Human Rights Office at the TDSB against Trustee Lelka, alleging that the statement that she had made was somehow discriminatory and a breach of the Code of Conduct for Trustees. And that led to a 7-month investigation into her conduct. And ultimately, the Integrity Commissioner came back with a report that was discussed at the board, or considered by the board last week, that had found that it wasn't an issue necessarily of what Trustee Lelka had said. It was an issue of what she hadn't said. And that because she did not, at the same time as calling out poisonous anti-Semitism, also affirmed that there were other positive aspects of the materials, that she was somehow in breach of the Code of Conduct, that was somehow discriminatory. I mean, that's a standard that I don't think anybody would find reasonable. It's not a standard that anybody else is held to. And it was a serious problem. And of course, it was outrageous. And the majority of trustees saw right through it. The fact that the Integrity Commissioner relied on the conclusions of an independent investigator who has a clear public record of taking positions on issues related to the Israel-Palestinian conflict and anti-Semitism in a way that certainly suggests there could be a conflict of interest or bias in this case, I think really brought to light just how flawed this process was and how flawed the outcome was as a result, and motivated those trustees to vote against it. It wasn't unanimous. There were a number of trustees who voted in favor of receiving the report from the Integrity Commissioner rather than rejecting it outright. And that's of course cause for concern, some of whom, and they did so with a variety of motivations, and it's something that we're following up on as an organization. And I encourage people, if you're concerned about the way your trustee voted, to reach out to them and have a constructive conversation about that. But of course, anti-Semitism at the TDSB isn't just about this one incident. It's not just about the materials in May. It's not just about Trustee Lelka being singled out for correctly identifying anti-Semitism and the promotion of violence against our community and against Israelis. It's a deeper problem. It's a systemic problem. And in fact, the Integrity Commissioner's report points this out. While there's a lot to be critical of in that report, particularly around the conclusions about Trustee Lelka's conduct, the Integrity Commissioner also affirmed that the Human Rights Office at the TDSB mishandled the entire thing, that they failed to fully understand anti-Semitism, and as a result, did not address it in the way that they should. And in doing so, the Integrity Commissioner used the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, which is something that the Ontario government has adopted, something the Canadian government has adopted, governments around the world, the United Nations, the European Union. It is the consensus standard for investigating anti-Semitism. And the fact that she used it and found that the board's Human Rights Office was lacking in their engagement with it is something that's really important and something that we want to build on moving forward to make sure that the problems of failing to address anti-Semitism at the TDSB, particularly within the Human Rights Office, are addressed and fixed so that we can create a more nurturing environment for all learners in the system and all staff, where Jews can be comfortable and safe and confident and have an education in an environment that I think everybody would agree should be free of anti-Semitism.
Absolutely. And, you know, you raise such an important point that this one issue highlights that there are ongoing issues, that there are other issues, and that there are things that we can do about them. So I'd love to think a little bit more about what some of the other incidents that we are seeing in our schools, and in thinking through that IRA definition of anti-Semitism, how and why are some of these incidents anti-Semitic?
So, you know, a lot of these incidents are pretty obvious, right? A kid is bullied with anti-Jewish epithets. A kid is bullied with slogans, slurs about, you know, Hitler was right, or the Jews should have been gassed, okay? There's awful, grotesque things that are being said to our children. Sometimes these sort of Nazi era, neo-Nazi type slogans are actually punctuated with Free Palestine, which is an interesting coming together of different, you know, political expressions directed at Jews and targeting Jewish students. We're seeing it not just at the TDSB, but across all the GTA school boards. I can tell you of incidents in the York Region District Board. I can tell you of an incident in the Peel Board where a child had to actually leave their school, their middle school. And I think that's another point, is that we're seeing this impacting kids, not just in high schools, where, you know, we saw a protest a number of weeks ago where children were shouting the slogan, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," but also predominantly in middle school, where kids are picking stuff up online or at home or in the gaming world, and it's spilling over into the classroom environment or the virtual classroom environment. And these kids being bullied with swastikas drawn onto their papers, or threats of swastikas being drawn on their bodies. It's not just, you know, white kids doing this. It's all different kinds of people from all different walks of life. It's a real problem that needs to be addressed. To their credit, the TDSB has run a number of really impactful interventions after the fact to address some of these things, and that's good. But I'd like to take a moment just to speak about, and I think that brings to light, you know, it's not just the incidents that we're seeing that are a problem or that we need to focus in on, it's also the response to those incidents. Mm-hmm. So it's one thing if there's a kid who shouts out something anti-Semitic in a classroom, and there needs to be an intervention to deal with that, and that's fine. But what happens when there are materials that are distributed that are clearly anti-Semitic, and that person is reinstated ostensibly without consequence? It's the lack of response sometimes that causes grave concern, or the erasure of Jewish experience. And what I mean by that is often what we're seeing is a response, oh, you know, it's not that bad. It's not that bad, like, let's just sweep this aside. Or it's a questioning of the Jewish person bringing it forward in a way that's not appropriate. Or you know, really not taking it seriously, not dealing with it in a serious way, not having effective responses, or even having colleagues or superiors, right? If you're a teacher in the board, I know there are a number of incidents where their vice principals or principals might actually applaud something, not necessarily knowing that it's anti-Semitism, but when they're told that it's anti-Semitism, it's not a response of horror, it's a response of, no, that can't be right. And that's a reaction we need to deal with. And it's not a TDSB problem, that's a societal problem. And if you look in the news recently, federal Canadian public servants have organized to fight against systemic anti-Semitism from this very thing, that their concerns weren't being taken seriously, that it wasn't being addressed effectively, it was getting swept aside. And that should ring alarm bells across our society, that this is a phenomenon that needs to be dealt with, whether at the TDSB, the York Region Board, in Peel, or in government or the workplace. This is a phenomenon that transcends those boundaries.
Absolutely, and we're doing it all together. You make that point, and it is so clear the work that we've done in coming together this past week as well, behind teachers and in our support. This is coming from parents and grandparents, concerned community members left and right, people who are outside of the Toronto District School Board. There is a community of concern coming together. So I'd love to think about together as our last question here until we get to the Q&A at the end. And again, I invite everybody to leave a question in the Q&A. We'll be coming back to those questions. Feel free to message me privately. We'd love to hear from you, and we'll have some time at the end to unpack some of your personal questions here. But what are some of the ways that we can make a difference? Our parents, our grandparents, our students, our administrators, we all have a role to play in this beautiful community that we are a part of. What are some of the things that we can do and take away from this evening as next steps?
Noah, you're 100% correct. We all have a role to play. CJA has a role to play as a community advocacy organization representing a broad swath of our exceptional Jewish community here in Toronto. But every single one of us has a job to do. If we don't want school boards to sweep anti-Semitism under the rug, we can't do so either. We need to speak up, we need to speak out, and we need to raise these issues when they come up. And it's always easiest to do that and most effective to do that as a group rather than as an individual. And so I'd encourage anybody here who are educators, who work within one of the public school boards, to reach out to your affinity group. Each of the boards has a Jewish affinity group. Some of them are relatively new, if you're talking about the Peel board. Some of them are very sophisticated, like the one at the Toronto District School Board. Get involved with those affinity groups, because there is strength in numbers. And it's clear that if you're raising a concern, it's not just one person, it's an entire group of people who are representative of Jewish staff within a school board. And that's an important voice of internal stakeholders for the board to consider. And so if you're not comfortable speaking to your vice principal or your principal for whatever reason, you can speak to the affinity group, and they can and help to raise those issues up the food chain, so to speak. And it's really important that we report, because without reporting, it's as though nothing happened. And if there isn't a record of things happening, it's very hard to get effective solutions to be brought to bear. And it's not just the affinity groups. There are a number of other groups that have created a safe space for educators to come together and have been very active as well. And it's great to join in those efforts. They've been very effective. Particularly, it's also important for educators to get involved in their unions. In a number of cases, these unions have been hijacked by a small group of activists with a very clear anti-Israel agenda. And as we saw with the CUPE convention that happened recently, where a BDS resolution failed, we can see what happens when people wake up and take interest and get engaged in the face of some of these things. The more engaged we are in these spaces, the better chance we'll have at making sure that they don't go down a dark path that accepts anti-Semitism into the environment.
That's such a beautiful thought, the engagement. The idea too that we're all at a different place. Some of us are in a different space in our activism spectrum, but getting engaged, reaching out is the very first thing you can do. If you're not already connected, get connected, and if you are connected, get more involved. My work here at Genesis and in collaboration with CJA is all about supporting all of you. So Noah, thank you so much for sharing some of those thoughts. Please, if you have something else to add.
There's two more things, and I
Absolutely.
apologize. I'll keep it short.
Not to
For
worry.
students, there are Jewish student clubs all across Toronto. I was surprised to learn how many there are in the Toronto board in particular. Some of them are very sparsely attended. If you are a Jewish student or you are a Jewish parent of a Jewish student, encourage them to get involved in these clubs. It creates an environment where there's a safe space to be Jewish, a place for people to come together, not just at their school, but across different schools, and to help organize against some of these challenges that we're seeing coming up in our midst. And the last thing, Noah, is exactly what you just said. You have an entire community infrastructure behind you. You are not alone. You are not just a group of educators or parents, although there's tremendous power in being a group of educators or a group of parents, but you are backstopped by CJA, by UJA, and we're here to support you, to help strategize with you, and to bring our resources to bear to to amplify your voices and advance the cause that we all hold so dear. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Noah. I'm so grateful you could join us this evening, and I'm looking forward to our Q&A at the end of the webinar. And so thank you so much. I'm really also grateful to welcome Dr. Rachel Fish this evening, who will be speaking with us. I had the great pleasure of hearing Dr. Fish speak earlier this year, and I'm so glad that she could join us. Dr. Fish is the co-founder of Boundless and a scholar warrior. She has served as the executive director of the Foundation to Combat Anti-Semitism, senior advisor and resident scholar at the Paul E. Singer Foundation in New York City, and executive director of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies at Brandeis University. She is a frequent speaker in various Jewish community forums and beyond. And so I hope you'll join me in welcoming Dr. Rachel Fish. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Noah. It's a pleasure to be here. And I appreciated hearing Noah's remarks as well. As someone who is not in Canada, is not in the Toronto community, it does seem as if you all as educators are facing many challenges at this point in time. My sort of task for this evening and what I was asked to do is to share with you a little bit of a presentation in terms of thinking about how anti-Semitism has transformed over time and the ways in which it manifests today. I'm going to share my screen with you. I want to say, because of time, we are not going to go into all of the detail that is required if we were to do this in a historically rigorous manner, but it gives you at least the contours of this conversation, which I'm sure most of you are very familiar with, and allows us to think together during the Q&A about how this kind of education can be brought into the public schools and into the Toronto community in a meaningful way. So I'm going to share my screen and we're just going to jump right in. You all have seen the statistics from last year, from this year, that have been a wake-up call. And I can tell you from the American Jewish perspective, for many American Jews, a serious wake-up call in terms of the increased sentiment around Jew hatred that we are seeing, spanning the ideological and political spectrum. We have seen from reports, whether it's the FBI, whether it's the American Jewish Committee, the Holocaust Materials Claims Conference, staggering statistics that highlight not only the increase in anti-Semitism, but the real lack of education and knowledge to understand what anti-Semitism is all about. And of course, the younger you go, the younger generations obviously know less about this subject matter and are engaged less in terms of situating this within a broader historical context and don't have the requisite knowledge or information to be able to understand how these transformations of Jew hatred have emerged. When we did some research with the Craft organization to combat anti-Semitism, we actually interviewed 13 to 35-year-olds across the country here in America, and they were demographically representative. And we asked those 13 to 35-year-olds, what is anti-Semitism? The majority answer, IDK, I don't know. Those who then tried to venture a guess say, well, what's a Semite? And then, of course, we hear from individuals, I'm anti-racist, I'm anti-homophobic, I'm anti-Islamophobic, so I must be an anti-Semite. And we're thinking, no, you're not an anti-Semite, you're an anti-Semite, but they don't even understand the terminology or the language that is being used. And so part of our job as educators is to help them understand what this phenomena is and the ways in which it has shifted. Now, we know there are a variety of definitions. You heard from Noah about the IHRA definition, which is a working definition. It is not legally bound in any way, but it is a significant definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, because it is utilized by international governments, international agencies. Here in the States, many states and even local municipalities have adopted the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism. We also know that there are definitions like the top bullet that you hear from the ADL and other organizations, such as prejudice, discrimination, and oppression directed towards Jews. What I want to say about this is that all of these definitions are important. All of these definitions are necessary. I use a very clear and simple definition. The definition that I utilize is that anti-Semitism is ultimately the desire to eliminate, whether it's physical elimination or the erasure of identity, that kind of elimination, around Judaism, the Jewish people, and the collective Jewish identity organized in the state of Israel. So that's the definition that I have used and come back to readily, because I feel that it accurately represents how this phenomena presents itself. As we know, anti-Semitism is a conspiracy theory. It is the idea that Jews have outsized proportional influence. They are the puppet masters controlling all aspects of society. And it is a phenomena that utilizes the ability to say that the Jew is everything and nothing, meaning it is the Jew who can be the consummate capitalist and also be the communist. It is the Jew who epitomizes being too pacifistic or being too militaristic. And so this idea that the Jew can literally be blamed for any of the challenges that a society may have, and use the Jew and Judaism, and at times even Israel, as a scapegoat for these world problems, that is anti-Semitism. So let's talk a little bit about, and we're going to do this very quickly, how anti-Semitism has emerged over time. We know the first form that exists in terms of anti-Jewish sentiment or Judeophobia is around hatred of Judaism and the adherence to Judaism. And this becomes most clear once you have the emergence of Christianity. It is concretized, of course, in Christian theological frameworks, and then throughout history in the European context, specifically with the Catholic Church as a major institution, with governance and kings as a major institution, policies, church and state, church and empire meld in order to directly marginalize, exclude, prejudice, and stereotype Jews. There are certain tropes that emerged during this period of time, like the blood libel, which emerges in Trent in the 12th century and spreads beyond borders like a virus. We all know the familiar metaphor at this point in time. The idea that Jews use the blood of Christian children for the purpose of Jewish ritual practice by seducing these children and harming them so that Jews ultimately benefit. And again, you see in this kind of image from a wood cutting in the 15th century, this is Simon of Trent, the depiction of this ritual murder, the way in which the Jew with the crooked nose, nefarious looking, physically harming the child. Now, we also know that it doesn't just focus this Jew hatred coming from a European context. That is the primary It is the dominant paradigm at this point in time, but there also is Jew hatred that emerges within Islamic societies. And we understand that the Jew, even though the Jew is Dar al-Kitab, a people of the book, this Jew is still seen as having second-class citizenship, Zimmi status. And with that status, it means there needs to be a protected tax that is paid with the jizya. And because of the political theological framing that exists within radical Islamism, think about organizations like Hamas, Hezbollah, ISIS, ISIL, Al-Qaeda, Taliban, you name it. The idea here is that ultimately these radical Muslim ideologies have to exist and be continued in the realm of Islam, anywhere that Islam existed in territories, to reinstate the caliphate, which means that any entity that is not submissive to Islam is considered to be an infidel, and you must engage in Dar el-Harb, the realm of war. So this is sort of the first kind of wave of anti-Jewish sentiment that exists. During the period of the 19th century and the 20th century, Jews are still despised because of their religion, particularly in a European context. And it becomes clear that it's not only because of their religion, because when Jews tried to convert even from Judaism to Christianity, it is clear, based upon the works of the pseudoscience and the emergence of eugenics, this idea that one person's DNA is inferior or superior to another person's DNA. And Jews are told clearly that just because you converted from Judaism, your DNA is immutable. And if your DNA is immutable, it means that you inherently cannot change who you are, the associations you are connected to, the community and identity group you are connected to. And therefore, this is going to be a challenge to not just your religious affiliation, your confessional identity, but now your identity as a people. And as a people, you cannot change that relationship. Now, in the European context, during the 19th century, Jews are often referred to as the Easterner, the Oriental, the Semite. The idea of Semite is the idea that the territory of the Levant, which becomes what we now refer to as the Mediterranean, a geographical location, within that territory, there were Semitic peoples, peoples who spoke Semitic languages, who had shared similar systems in terms of linguistics. That's where the term Semitic comes from, the Semitic languages. It's then applied to the category of geography as well. For the anti-Semitism conversation, Jews in Europe are referred to as Semites. It is not non-Jews. It is not Muslims. It is not Arabs who are referred to as Semites. It is Jews. That is why Wilhelm Marr in 1879, as a German, says, let's no longer use the German phrase Judenhass, Jew hatred or hatred of Jews, but rather now we will use the term antisemitismus, anti-Semitism. It is a much more sanitized version of Judenhass, and it becomes more politically acceptable to engage in anti-Semitic practices because it doesn't seem as if it is directly related to Jews because of their religious identity. Of course, with the rise of nationalism and the connection between one's blood and one's connection to a particular territory, it exacerbates sentiments of xenophobia. It exacerbates identity around who is native to a particular place, who is excluded from that particular place. An Aryan identity emerges in the German context, and Jews, of course, understand that this is going to mean greater discrimination, less inclusion in German society. All of this, of course, then we see the results during the atrocities of the Holocaust, when anti-Semitic actions and practices result in the annihilation of 6 million Jews, and of course, 5.5 to 6 million others who are deemed to be othered within society. So here's that shift from hatred of Jews because of a religious affiliation to hatred of Jews because of a affiliation as a people. Now, the next transformation that takes place is one that not everyone in the Jewish community feels comfortable addressing or talking about. And that is the hatred that exists when Jews identify with the collective identity and movement of liberation and emancipation and self-determination known as Zionism, and ultimately the construction of the state of Israel. And we will talk in just a moment how this particular form of Jew hatred has presented itself, basically beginning in the period of the 2000s, most recently, but then also just this past May. Now, first of all, we know that this form of anti-Semitism doesn't start at all just in the 2000s period. We know that during the Soviet Union, during even the Russian Empire, Jews and Zionism became synonymous with one another. So it was not just Jews control the media, or Jews control the banks, or Jews are colonialists. It was Zionists are colonialists. Zionists control the banks. And that kind of language and exchange of language was very intentional on the part of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, because that had incredible influence that the Soviet Union held within the Arab world. That kind of language infiltrated within the Arab world because of the Cold War and communism and democracy and what was playing out in the region of the Middle East. That language also gets picked up not only by the Arab world, but also by international organizations like the United Nations. And this is when you see Zionism equated with racism in 1970s with UN Resolution 3379. And it is not until the 1990s that that is repealed by the UN, but the damage has clearly been done. It's like the big lie. If you repeat it enough, it will be absorbed by the larger political and cultural societies and frameworks and institutions in which we live. And that is what has happened. Not everyone had been paying attention in the community around this use of language, and so therefore have been taken off guard basically to see how this language now exists and is interwoven into much of the conversation around Israel, the perception of Israel on the global stage, let alone the conversations where Israel conversation directly intersects with the anti-Semitism conversation. All of you know that former Soviet refusenik Natan Sharansky came up with what he called the 3D test. And when he comes up with this idea of the 3D test, which I believe was in the period of the 2000s, early 2000s, he did it because he said, I want to be very clear. This is not criticism of Israeli policy. We want to critique Israel. We can do so. Every kind of Israeli does it. Jews ought to be doing it in order to think about how to improve and make this place and aspire to be both Jewish and democratic. But for him, he said, what's happening here and what we're hearing happening is that Israel is held to a double standard. Israel is demonized, dehumanized, and delegitimized. And when that is what is taking place, we have to ask ourselves, what are the motives for that? Why is that happening? And when the starting place is, does Israel have a right to exist? And the answer is no, because it is deemed to be born in sin, then something is going on. Now in May, what we saw, whether it was in the Boulevard of Los Angeles, some of the streets in suburbs of the UK, whether it was in the streets of New York, were that Jews, irrespective of their relationship with Israel and Zionism, were actually perceived as an extension of Israeli behavior and Israeli action. And so when Jews were being attacked in those places, no one said to them, what do you think of Netanyahu's policy? No one said, how do you feel about the settlements? Where do you think the green light should be? Would you vote for this or that prime minister? That was not the conversation. What was happening in those mobs was, where are the Jews? Modern day pogroms, modern day action of Cossacks, targeting Jews because of their perception or their real or imagined relationship with Israel and Zionism. And of course, we saw this play out on social media as well. And this particular piece, just to give you a sense and why you have to be careful of whether or not you engage with social or tell students to engage with social, is because some of what is created on social is by outside foreign influence. This one in particular is from Iran. China also has had some outside foreign influence, and it is in intent to engage in a conversation, meddle in a conversation in order to encourage detractors and encourage a change in perception politically around the US-Israel relationship and also the North American relationship for Canada and Israel. Now, what I'm going to say here focuses more on the American scene, but I think there are some pieces that are applicable to Canada, but I am not an expert on Canadian politics. But I'll just say very quickly, the way in which we see these expressions of anti-Semitism today are coming from the hard right, they're coming from the hard left, they're coming from within radical Islamism. What is important for me to be able to do is when I see any form of anti-Semitism, irrespective of its place of origin, is to be able to label it, identify it, call it out, or if people are just ignorant and lacking the education, call them in for an opportunity to be sensitized and learn more. When we don't call out anti-Semitism or label it or identify it, because we are coming from one of these political positions or because of an ideological orientation, that is when we ourselves are guilty of politicizing anti-Semitism. And that becomes ultimately problematic. On the political hard right here in this country, we understand how this plays out, the connection between white supremacy, xenophobia, the othering of Jews that has been part of a larger white supremacy framework that exists as part of American history. And we have seen, like in Charlottesville, the association between Nazism and the South will rise again, the Confederacy idea. We're coming up on the anniversary of January 6th Capitol insurrection, in which we saw individuals very clearly wearing their swag of 6 million were not enough, as Proud Boys, as individuals who are hardcore detractors and do not want Jews to replace them, like the chant heard in Charlottesville, Jews will not replace us, which is an idea that has existed since the period of the 1920s, 1930s in this country that stems from larger conversations around the idea of xenophobia and immigrants. And once again, is also a larger conversation about how supersessionism within Christian ideas have become secularized within white supremacist ideas. We also saw specifically in this country, but also we saw through in Germany and other European countries, that there were comparisons made between the Corona app or the idea of tracking those who had access to the vaccine and the idea that tracking or having the ability was akin to having to wear a yellow Magen David, a yellow Star of David, as a Jew was forced to do during the Holocaust. This, of course, was picked up also in Kentucky and South Carolina, and then even sold once again as part of, paraphernalia within a hat store in South Carolina. Of course, the coronavirus did not at all stay, I'm going to use a bad analogy here, immune to dealing with anti-Semitism. Rather, COVID itself was perceived as being a Jewish disease. The Jew here under the microscope, which represents corona, nefarious looking, the traditional anti-Semitic perceptions of the Jew. And that idea too of the Jew and coronavirus was also picked up by radical conspiracy theory organizations like QAnon, which in the identity politics here in this country is actually gaining influence and not, unfortunately, greater marginalization. We also know anti-Semitism exists on the hard left. The conversation on the hard left is not the same as the hard right. It is much easier for Jews to identify anti-Semitism on the hard right. It is more obvious. We understand those tropes more clearly. On the hard left, what we have seen is that the conversation has been around a perception of Jews being white, of Jews being privileged, therefore being the oppressor, being the colonialist, the imperialist. And these ideas and the language here really matters and has deep roots in the academic environment that begins in a conversation in the late 1960s and 1970s with a variety of intellectual ideas that have aided in creating and cultivating hostility toward Israel and supporters of Israel for quite a long time, that the Jewish community was not paying very close attention to. Those ideas didn't just stay in the academy. Those ideas have spread way beyond the university. And we're talking, and I can talk more about it if you're interested, postmodernism, post-nationalism, post-colonialism, the influence of Edward Said's Orientalism. Those kinds of ideas went way beyond the university and have now entered mainstream discourse, whether it's media, traditional or social, politics, whether it's social justice conversations, and as many of you know, it is now in the K through 12 educational system. So I'll just want to share a few quick examples here of social media that we saw in May that highlight examples of the use of language here. The idea, once again, that children were being murdered who were a particular skin color, brown, that they were native, that they were indigenous, and being displaced by an occupying powerful army, and that this is not a complicated issue, so you cannot use complexity in this conversation. The idea, once again, here by Susan Sarandon. One was Halsey as a musician, Susan Sarandon as an actress, talking about Israel engaging in ethnic cleansing, being a settler colonialist state. This kind of language is language that comes from a formation coming from the hard left that now exists on these devices. And when young people encounter it, they do not understand what is actually happening here. And they're not sure, is this criticism of Israel or is this ultimately anti-Semitic? We saw, for example, the social media channel So You Want to Talk About. It became a very popular social media channel during the President Trump administration. And they talked about ethnic cleansing of Palestine and ethnic cleansing period, where the primary example is going to be al-Nakba, the catastrophe, the Arabic term used to discuss the 1948 war or the War of Independence or the War of Israel's establishment. But again, with a very, very superficial understanding and using very loaded, emotional, divisive language in order to provoke and to create divisions within the user who is seeing this. We also saw, for example, an image here. It's a reflection on the events of what happened in Minnesota with George Floyd. We have the policeman with his knee and his leg on the necks, not only of an African-American and Black individual, but also Palestinians and Native Americans. And again, the language is very, very clear. It is all rooted in the settler colonialism mentality and the deeply systematized belief of the supremacy of one race over another. And then, of course, the association with Black Lives Matter. Now, yes, this was created by a Palestinian artist. This is created as a way to represent activism. This also was sent out and tweeted by the Palestinian Authority. This gets picked up by the Black Lives Matter movement. And you see, because of social, it is amplified tenfold and at a rate that most humans cannot keep up with. Now, I just want to give you, one last example here on social, just to show you how different, and this actually, if you know Orientalism and Edward Said's work, this is actually an excellent example to show exactly the impact of Orientalism. The Slow Factory, again, left of center social media channel, during the May 2021 conflict, wrote and created the post on the left. You see here the language, what is happening in Palestine is not complicated. It's settler colonialism and ethnic cleansing, debunking misinformation around Palestine. And of course, the image is quite emotional and literally incendiary. Here on the right, as America is withdrawing from Afghanistan, late August, early September, the Slow Factory writes the following: "It is not possible to condense decades of conflict into a single Instagram post. What's happening in Afghanistan is complex. It's nuanced and devastating. We encourage our community to take time to explore this list of resources. a very calm blue color. And all of a sudden, there's no mention of Taliban. There's no mention of the acts of violence towards women. It's complicated. So you see here, this is the way in which Orientalism pushes a particular agenda. In this case, Israel, white colonialist oppressor. It's simple. Here's the solution and here's the problem, because it all rests with Israel's actions, because Israel was born in sin. But here's the case in which Afghanistan, an Eastern-oriented country, Westerners can't impose their own perspectives or values on this particular place because it is complicated. So you have to be able to teach, and that's the key point here that I want to share with the educators. And I know many of you do this and think about this all the time, how we teach critical thinking, to hone those critical thinking skills, and that we don't want students and young people to just continue to scroll while abandoning that critical thinking. So we want to create these brave spaces in which students can ask the intellectually challenging questions, and that they have the capacity in these spaces to be empowered and feel confident enough to challenge the herd mentality. We want them to be asking, just like they would interrogate or, in an exercise around any primary source that they read in history or literature, whatever the subject may be, who's writing this? For what purpose? Who's the intended audience? What facts are included? What facts are marginalized? What are the various narratives that are constructed around the actual post or the message that they are hearing? Is there a particular call to action? Can they identify the motivation? And then with an adult, because they do need adult guidance, help them think through, do they want to engage, whether it's in real life or on social? And it obviously is highly dependent which context it is. And if they want to engage, for what purpose? Is it because it's someone they know and they want to have a conversation and it's not a detractor and they think this person just doesn't have the full picture? Is it a don't know or an undecided who they think they may be able to help sensitize? Is it because they want to share their own personal experiences or perspectives? Or do they actually want to challenge the distortions or lies that are being presented? The other piece in doing so is, how do you do this? And when we ask, how do we do this? Again, depending on the medium, will just help you decide which of this kind of language or tools is most useful. If you're going to do it online, then that's a certain approach. And the goal is ultimately to get the conversation in real life and not for it to stay online. But there's also something to be said, if a friend of yours does post something, how do you help situate that conversation so that others who see it understand that what is being presented is problematic, is not the whole story. There are certain language tools that are useful, and really those tools are in the framing of questions. Meaning, if a student particularly, or a young person, or even you as educators and professionals working with your colleagues, are able to help hit the pause button when you hear something that is troubling, that is anti-Semitic, and it is someone that you think you can have a real conversation with, and it's not an outright detractor, then the conversation starts with asking the questions, right? So it could be anything from, when I hear you use that term, or when I heard you say a traditional anti-Semitic trope like dual loyalty, I want to share with you what that means because I'm not sure you fully understand. Or do you know what that means? If you hear an entire generalization around a stereotype of Jews, Judaism, or Israel, you could say to someone, I'm hearing language that you're using that is making sweeping generalizations. You realize that when you paint a community in one particular voice or in one particular way, ultimately that seeks to harm that community, right? So can I ask why you're doing that? So there are ways to engage in that conversation when you think the person with whom you want to engage isn't seeking to actually harm. Obviously, if the intent is to harm, if the intent is violence, if the intent is to engage in any kind of physical issue, you need to call the police. You need to make sure the security professionals know. You need to be able to report it to the appropriate Jewish organizational agency as well, and report it as a hate crime. But the reality from not many of these like in-person interactions is that there is a real lack of education, a lot of political agendas, and there's enormous opportunity to at least try to ameliorate or mitigate anti-Semitism, knowing full well that you cannot actually ultimately eradicate it. So once again, part of that conversation is thinking about how you cultivate and build these brave spaces. And it's a combination. Calling people into a conversation, I should say not to eradicate, but ameliorate or mitigate. Calling out when it is clear, explicit anti-Semitism, where Jew hatred exists, and denounce it unequivocally, whether it's from the hard left, the hard right, or radical Islamism. And I will also say that it's building the conversation within your own identity community, because that is where you can have the greatest influence, rather than shooting bows across the aisle, trying to point fingers at another community who may be engaged in anti-Semitic practices, because you're not going to have much influence with that other community. So you want to try to influence the people that have the same vested interest in you and who will actually listen to you because you have a rapport with them, a relationship with them, and you have meaningful, substantive reasons to engage with them. We also, of course, know that because there needs to be greater sensitivity, because there needs to be the ability to humanize, just like the wave of diversity, equity, and inclusion offerings that now exist in order to educate a variety of communities around other forms of hatred. There are real opportunities to do this with administrators of schools, with superintendents, with educators themselves, and also specifically with the parent community. But this takes real time, it takes practice, and you educators know that it doesn't happen overnight. Many of these issues, the seeds for these issues have been sown for generations. So this problem is not going to be solved with a quick snap of the fingers. And we have to be in it for the long haul in order to do what you all do best, which is to teach critical thinking skills, to build compassion, and to educate based upon our understanding of history and the way that history has transformed to the present. So Noah, that's what I have.
That's amazing. Oh, Rachel, thank you so much, Dr. Fish. We're so grateful. We've got a few questions here in the chat that I'd like to get to, and I would love to bring Noah Schack back here as well. And this is a perfect segue. We've talked so much tonight about the power of language. So there are some more questions around, from a few people around, when is something anti-Semitic? Are people writing things off as kids being kids? How can you tell the difference between somebody who is open to an educational opportunity and somebody who is coming at something with bad intent? So we'll start with Noah, if you want to offer some thoughts there.
Sure. I think we have some very recent examples of how to sort of parse those types of situations, and some really good data on it here in the Canadian context. We've done a lot of polling over the years around Canadian attitudes towards Jews, and that polling continually shows that anti-Semitism is really, for a vast majority of people, is a problem of ignorance. People don't want to be anti-Semitic. And when it's pointed out to them that something is anti-Semitic, they want to distance themselves from it. And so that's a positive thing. And there's a tremendous opportunity that we have in engaging in authentic conversations and constructive conversations with people who may be colleagues or friends who shared social media posts that were anti-Semitic without knowing it, or reinforced an anti-Semitic position without really having a sense of what they were doing. And I think the test is when you engage with somebody in an open and authentic way in a conversation that reaches out to them to try to help them understand the impact that those things have on you as their friend or their colleague. If they lean into that conversation and want to learn more, if they're horrified by the fact that they did something that had that impact on you, that's a conversation worth continuing. If their response is, anti-Semitic notions about you having a Jewish agenda or weaponizing anti-Semitism, if they push you away, they're not open to having the dialogue necessary to learn about anti-Semitism and to change that behavior with themselves. And you've got a bigger problem on your hands. But again, the vast majority of people won't respond that way. And it's absolutely worth extending a hand to people in a way that's constructive rather than letting it sort of fester behind the scenes, because then it'll only get worse.
That's a great point. We want to keep our arms open and our doors open and our ears open. So I'll leave with one more question that I'd love to get both of your thoughts on, just about 30 seconds or so from each of you, if you could. What are a few things people can take into the classroom right now, some next steps into their schools that you'd like to leave people with as bridge builders in their community? Noah, if you want to complete a few thoughts, and then we'll go to Dr. Fish and we'll say good evening to everyone shortly.
So I think exactly what I just said. I think that, if you're afraid to speak up, if you're afraid to put yourself out there, that's totally a natural feeling for people. But again, to reach out to those who are around you, there are a number of organizations, both inside your peer group, within your school boards, and within the broader community that can support you and help to make sure that the concerns that you have are addressed one way or the other. And I think, Rachel had a very comprehensive overview of some of the challenges that we face and a really great way, a framework of understanding just how what we're up against. And I think, drawing from that, I think it's important to remember it's not about the anti-Semite, it's about the anti-Semitism. So it's not about whether this is anti-Israel anti-Semitism or neo-Nazi anti-Semitism. It's not about where it comes from or who's saying it. It's a matter of addressing the issue itself and encouraging others to do so as well, and pointing out that if we give it a pass anywhere, we're giving it a pass everywhere, and that it's not necessarily separate from the broader fight against hate generally. If we're not going to address anti-Semitism effectively in our classrooms and in our schools, we're going to fail to address the broader challenge of racism and hate writ large, and it needs to be part of that overall effort with dedicated proactive strategies and concrete steps. Now's the time for action. Absolutely, absolutely. Dr. Fish, did you want to add anything before we say goodnight?
I'll just say one thing, because I'm not oblivious to how hard this is for individuals to do. What we're asking people to do requires serious moral courage, and that's not easy. We know that there are real personal and professional consequences when people speak up, and we're living in a world right now in which cancel culture is the name of the game. So we can't pretend that's not a reality, and yet I say we still have to do it. And again, I'm not in Toronto, but it seems from what I'm hearing from Noah Squared over here, that both of them have the ability in the organized Jewish communal space to be resources for all of you, to help provide sort of the thinking and strategic approaches and tactical approaches to how to engage in these conversations. And I think you have to find ways to work at multiple levels of the ecosystem, because just addressing a particular teacher, just addressing a particular student, a particular superintendent does not solve the problem. It's like whack-a-mole. So as a community, you basically have to really map it out at the ecosystem level and figure out how you as teachers can organize yourselves in a very strong position, armed with the appropriate educational pieces, and clearly making the case of where anti-Semitism is seeping into the educational K-12 system, and ultimately the detriment and harm that will do to all of the students in the community. But you can do that, because the best advice I ever received from anyone was all it takes is a gang to make that difference. And from what I'm seeing here, you have the right gang in place, and you should, I think, take those necessary steps, even when they're hard, even when they're scary, and even when they open you up to vulnerability.
Thank you so much. This evening was really, as the title said, all about empowering educators. And both what Noah Schack has brought to us this evening and Dr. Fish, what you've brought to us this evening, is the power of language and the tools and the foundation of skills that we already have, both as engaged community members, but especially as educators. The tools of critical thinking, the knowledge of the power of language, how transformative that can be, the words that we choose, the impact that they can have, and how when we're coming together to use empowering language, we can really make change happen. So think of this for all of you as another step in your journey of engagement. If it is the first one, I thank you. If it is a continuation, stay engaged with us. Please reach out. We'll be sending resources to all of you tomorrow as well. And I would love to, if anybody would like to stay a few extra minutes, we'll discuss maybe some more about the TDSB, address a few issues a little bit closer, but I would love to close the evening with my great thanks to Dr. Fish, to Noah Schack, to everyone at UJA, to my colleague Jody Katzev, who's been so helpful in bringing this to all of you educators. And I would love to bring Jordan Sable, who is one of the co-chairs of our educators division, to say a few words as well. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much, everybody. And again, thanks to our speakers, Dr. Rachel Fish and Noah Schack, for all your insight tonight. My name is Jordan Sable. I'm the co-chair of UJA's Educators Division and a teacher and a parent at Tannenbaum Chat. While I was listening to this excellent presentation, I was thinking, what a time to be an educator in this community. I mean, we are facing a host of major challenges. Some of these are new. They have to do with social media and, of course, public health. But some, like anti-Semitism and hate, have been with us from the beginning. They demand our attention even in these most difficult times. And so we're very grateful to both of our speakers for spending the hour with us tonight. A lot of great resources were mentioned here, and a complete resource document will be emailed out to everyone tomorrow. We encourage you to take a deeper dive and keep this conversation going. As Leanne mentioned at the beginning of tonight's program, at UJA, we are here first and foremost to support our educators. So please do reach out as you continue to navigate these challenging issues inside and outside the classroom. Huge thanks to Noah Gano for moderating tonight. And thanks again to all of you for being here. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.